Behind the gates of a seemingly ordinary pig farm, one of Canada's darkest secrets was buried, literally. How did Robert Pickton manage to elude justice for years, and what even led to his eventual downfall? In the quiet, rural outskirts of Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, lies a place that, for years, remained under the radar of law enforcement and the public. At first glance, it seemed like any other small farm. But behind its gates, Robert Pickton, a man who grew up on the land, was hiding a horrific secret, a secret that would go on to haunt Canada, and indeed the world, for years to come. Robert Pickton's pig farm would eventually become the site of unimaginable horrors, where at least 20 women, many of them marginalized, were abducted, tortured, and murdered. This case would become one of the most chilling and notorious in Canadian history, sparking outrage, disbelief, and a national reckoning. For years, the authorities were blind to the signs. Despite missing women and mounting evidence, it wasn't until a decade after the first disappearance that Pickton's twisted reign of terror was uncovered. How was he able to operate in plain sight for so long, evading suspicion and avoiding capture? Tonight, we're going to take a deep dive into the chilling details of the pig farm murders, a case that will leave you questioning how such a nightmare could unfold so close to home. The victims, their lives and stories, are often lost in the shadow of the killer. We'll remember them here, those lives cut short too soon, while we uncover the horrors that took place on this seemingly quiet farm. What led a man like Robert Pickton to become one of Canada's most infamous serial killers? But before we go deeper, ask yourself this: how could this happen right under the nose of the community? How could a farm, surrounded by so many, remain undetected for so long? And please, if you love and appreciate hard work and good contents, kindly subscribe to our channel to encourage. Let's now explore the chilling details of this case. Robert Pickton was born in 1949, in a small rural town in British Columbia. From the beginning, his life was intertwined with the land, growing up on his family's pig farm in Port Coquitlam, a place that would later become the setting for unimaginable crimes. The Pickton family farm was a sprawling property, surrounded by dense forests, fields, and the distant echo of the city's industrial bustle. For Robert, it was a secluded world. His parents, both hardworking and reclusive, ran the farm without much interaction with their neighbors. Robert, a quiet and awkward boy, took to the farm's animals, particularly the pigs, but his relationship with people was distant and strained. Even as a child, he stood out. He was known to be socially awkward, reserved, and often uncomfortable in the company of others. But behind his withdrawn demeanor lay a disturbing combination of traits that would later manifest in horrifying ways. As Robert entered his teenage years, his behavioral problems started to surface more clearly. He was known to have a strange fascination with death and cruelty, and there were reports of him torturing small animals, often a sign of a deeply disturbed mind. His peers, teachers, and even his family started noticing oddities, but they would go unaddressed. The isolation of the farm kept Robert away from the kind of scrutiny that might have helped him. His family, too caught up in the demands of the farm, seemed blind to the warning signs of their son's growing darkness. As Robert became an adult, the farm remained his home. In the 1970s and early 1980s, he and his brother, David, took over the farm's operation. But Robert's social life remained sparse, and his interactions with the outside world became more erratic. The quiet life on the farm had become Robert's prison, and it was on this isolated property that his crimes would begin to take shape. But what made the farm so perfect for Pickton? The location was eerily remote, set off the main roads and hidden from casual observers. The property was large, with acres of farmland and abandoned buildings. The isolation was key, not only to the privacy he craved but also to the cover it provided. The surrounding area, too, was economically deprived. Port Coquitlam and the nearby Vancouver neighborhoods were struggling with poverty, drugs, and homelessness. It was in these communities that many of the women who would disappear came from, marginalized, overlooked, and vulnerable. The downtown east side of Vancouver was one such area, notorious for its high levels of addiction, prostitution, and homelessness. Women in this neighborhood were often forgotten by society, their lives slipping into the cracks of a broken system. It's here that Robert Pickton would begin his deadly hunts. He targeted these women, often offering them a ride, drugs, or the illusion of safety, things they desperately needed. But once they stepped onto his property, they would vanish. The first reported disappearance was in 1995, when a woman named Sarah DeVries was last seen. She, like many others, was a woman of the streets, caught in a cycle of addiction and desperation. Her disappearance barely raised an eyebrow at first. Just another name added to a growing list of missing women from the area. It wasn't until years later, when the police began to investigate more closely, that they would realize how many others had vanished in the same mysterious way. Between 1995 and 2001, as many as 40 women went missing from Vancouver's downtown east side. But many of these disappearances were dismissed as vanishing acts, a tragic yet all too familiar part of the life many women in these communities led. Their cases went cold, without much attention from the police. The missing women weren't given the same urgency as cases involving other groups of people. Some of them were prostitutes, drug addicts, or simply women who lived on the margins of society, forgotten by the mainstream world. The systemic failure was clear. The police didn't connect the dots, and the women continued to disappear. Some reports claimed the disappearances were nothing more than lifestyle choices, while others saw them as mere statistical anomalies. But as the numbers grew, so did the suspicion. Was there something more sinister happening? Were these women being targeted? In the years that followed, families and friends of the missing women began to demand answers. But with each unanswered call, the fear grew. What if they were never going to be found? What if the police didn't care enough to investigate? For the women who lived in the shadows of society, it seemed all too clear that they had been forgotten, their lives worth less than those of others. But as we will see, a dark truth was lurking on the farm, and a reckoning was coming. As Robert Pickton's farm remained isolated, so did his dark desires. The women who would become his victims were, to him, little more than objects, vulnerable souls living on the fringes of society. But to the world, they were mothers, daughters, and sisters, each with their own dreams, their own stories, and their own lives cut short by the man who lured them to their deaths. Pickton's method of abduction was both simple and terrifyingly effective. He preyed on women who lived in the rough neighborhoods of Vancouver's downtown east side, where drugs, prostitution, and homelessness were rampant. Many of his victims were sex workers, women addicted to drugs, or those living in the shadows of society. Desperate for a way out, they were often lured by the false promise of a better life, or at least a temporary escape. Pickton used a variety of tactics to lure his victims to the farm. Some he approached directly on the streets, offering them money, drugs, or the promise of work. Others were simply in need of shelter, a place to escape their harsh reality, and they were drawn in by his seemingly harmless demeanor. Pickton had a way with words, a quiet charisma that masked the monster beneath. And for those women desperate enough, the farm seemed like a lifeline, a place of refuge, or so they believed. Once the women arrived, they were trapped. Pickton's farm, seemingly innocuous with its pigs and quiet surroundings, became the backdrop to their final moments. It was here that he could exert complete control, where his victims had nowhere to run. Reports would later reveal that some of the women were drugged, while others were physically overpowered. His tactics were cruel and methodical. Some victims were strangled, others were stabbed. But one thing remained constant: once they were dead, they were no longer of any use to him. It was what Pickton did next that would ultimately seal his fate. After murdering his victims, he went to great lengths to dispose of their bodies, ensuring that no trace of them would remain. The police would later uncover disturbing evidence of just how far Pickton had gone to hide his crimes. He had disposed of their remains in a way that was grotesque, even for a killer of his caliber. Pickton's method of disposal involved his pigs. He would grind up the bodies, mixing the remains with the animal feed, a horrifying tactic to destroy evidence. The pigs, who roamed the farm freely, unknowingly consumed what was left of their victims. Some remains were also found buried on the farm, and Pickton even admitted, during his confession, to using a meat grinder to break down the bodies. It was a nightmare made flesh, literally and figuratively, one that would take years to fully unravel. But the horror didn't stop there. When police finally raided the farm, they found a disturbing array of forensic evidence. Human DNA, blood traces, and the remnants of various women were scattered throughout the property. They found women's clothing, personal items, and photographs that confirmed what was happening on the farm, a chilling testament to the brutality and inhumanity of Robert Pickton. Perhaps the most haunting discovery was the large quantities of human tissue and body parts found in places no one should ever have to witness. Forensic experts later confirmed that Pickton had not only killed these women but had used their remains in ways that defied comprehension. The details, as disturbing as they were, painted a picture of a man who had been living in a private hell, a place where the laws of humanity no longer applied. And yet, for all the horror discovered on the farm, one question looms larger than the rest: how was Pickton able to continue his reign of terror for so long without being caught? Despite the growing number of disappearances and increasing public concern, it wasn't until 2002 that Robert Pickton's name even surfaced in connection with the case. Over the years, investigators had looked into the disappearances, but they had failed to draw any definitive connections. Pickton's name was not among the initial suspects, and the investigation into the missing women had faltered in the face of bureaucratic delays, miscommunication, and an all-too-common disregard for the marginalized women at the heart of the case. Pickton's ability to avoid detection for so long was due in large part to these failures. The missing women were never treated as a priority, and the links between the disappearances were not made early enough. When Pickton was finally arrested, it was not because of a breakthrough in the case, but because of a tip that led investigators to his farm, by pure chance. But how did this happen? How did Robert Pickton get away with so much for so long? The answers lie in the systemic failures of the investigation, a failure that allowed him to keep killing while the world remained oblivious to the true nature of the man behind the farm. The path to justice for the victims of Robert Pickton would be long and agonizing. For years, the investigation into the missing women was fraught with failure to connect the dots, failure to prioritize the disappearances, and, perhaps most disturbingly, a failure to see the pattern that was hiding in plain sight. For years, law enforcement dismissed reports and concerns, leaving families of the missing women desperate for answers. The Vancouver Police Department and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, had received multiple tips, complaints, and warnings about a possible connection between the disappearances. But nothing was done. In fact, the case was poorly handled from the start. Many of the missing women were marginalized members of society, and their cases didn't get the same attention that more mainstream disappearances might have. To the authorities, these women were often seen as nothing more than statistics, addicts, prostitutes, and drifters whose lives weren't deemed worthy of the urgency they deserved. In one particularly troubling example, family members and concerned citizens repeatedly pointed out the possibility that the missing women were connected, but these concerns were often dismissed by the authorities as paranoia. There was little communication between the different law enforcement agencies investigating the disappearances, with each department operating in isolation, making it harder to see the bigger picture. But as the years passed, a breakthrough finally came in 2002. It would not be a moment of grand detective work or sharp instincts. It would come through an unlikely turn of events, a tip that led investigators to Robert Pickton's pig farm. It all began with a raid. Pickton's farm, once a place of mystery, was finally targeted. The investigation had been slow, but a breakthrough finally occurred when a woman who had narrowly escaped Pickton's grasp came forward to the police. She had been attacked by him but managed to escape, and her detailed description of the farm, combined with her statement, set the investigation into motion. On February 22, 2002, a team of investigators armed with a search warrant arrived at Robert Pickton's property. What they discovered in the barns, the buildings, and the surrounding areas was nothing short of horrific. The farm, which had long been seen as just another rural property, was now revealed as the site of unimaginable violence. Inside one of the trailers on the farm, investigators found a disturbing collection of evidence, items that linked Robert Pickton directly to the disappearances. DNA samples, photographs, and personal belongings from the missing women were discovered in various places around the property. There were also chilling traces of human blood found in the barn and on tools used for slaughtering animals. The chilling truth began to come together piece by piece. Perhaps the most significant discovery was the DNA evidence, which was found on some of Pickton's personal belongings. It was the missing piece that would connect him to multiple disappearances. Forensic experts later confirmed that the remains of several women had been on the farm, remains that had been hidden in plain sight, mixed with animal bones and discarded among the debris of everyday farm life. The chilling nature of the evidence confirmed what many had feared for years. Robert Pickton had been systematically murdering women and disposing of their bodies on the farm, all while the world looked away. The full scope of his crimes was now beginning to emerge, but this was just the beginning. The nightmare was far from over. The discovery of the bodies and the mounting evidence soon led to the arrest of Robert Pickton. But even as his arrest signaled the beginning of the end, it also opened a floodgate of questions. How had he managed to evade suspicion for so long? How had he slipped through the cracks of multiple investigations? And what had the authorities missed that allowed him to continue his horrific spree for so many years? As the details of the case began to unfold, the true horror of what had happened on the pig farm came to light. The public and the families of the missing women were left grappling with the knowledge that this man, who had blended so seamlessly into the fabric of his small town, was capable of such monstrous acts. The question remained, how had he avoided justice for so long? But the investigation was only the beginning. With each new piece of evidence, more questions arose, and the world would soon come to understand the full scope of the terror that had been unfolding for years in the quiet countryside of Port Coquitlam. The arrest of Robert Pickton marked the beginning of the end for the reign of terror on the pig farm. But even as the evidence mounted against him, the true horror of the case was far from over. The trial would unfold like a slow-motion nightmare, one that would expose the depths of Pickton's depravity and leave the families of the victims, and the public, grappling with questions that had no easy answers. As the trial began, Robert Pickton stood before the court, facing the enormity of the crimes he had committed. His defense team would argue that he was not guilty of all the murders, citing lack of intent in some cases and suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial. But the prosecution had a mountain of damning evidence, a mountain that no lawyer could discredit. In a chilling turn of events, during police interrogations, Pickton made a number of confessions that left everyone stunned. Though his lawyers would later try to suppress these statements, the details he revealed were horrifying. Pickton admitted to killing several women, but his descriptions of the murders, his cold, detached tone, his lack of remorse, sent a chill through everyone in the room. He spoke about the killings as if they were nothing more than a casual part of his daily routine, further confirming the depth of his monstrous nature. One of the most disturbing moments came when Pickton told detectives about the murders in the same nonchalant manner he would describe feeding his pigs. He had no emotion, no sense of the enormity of what he had done. His confessions were enough to send shivers down the spine of anyone listening. But even with this chilling insight into his mind, the trial would not be an easy one. Throughout the trial, the victims' families bravely took the stand, offering emotional testimonies that captured the humanity of the women who had been stolen from them. The stories were heart-wrenching, mothers who had lost daughters, sisters who had lost siblings, all describing the pain of knowing their loved ones had disappeared and, for so long, no one seemed to care. These emotional testimonies brought the case to life in a way that evidence alone never could. They reminded the court that these were not just nameless victims, they were real people, with families, with dreams, and with lives that had been brutally snatched away. In the end, the trial culminated with a life sentence for Robert Pickton. However, the Canadian legal system did not allow for the death penalty, meaning that Pickton would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The verdict was a bittersweet victory for the families, but the sentencing left many feeling a sense of unresolved anguish. Life imprisonment was seen as the best outcome available, but it could not undo the damage done, nor could it bring back the women whose lives had been taken. Public reaction to the verdict was mixed. While many expressed relief that Pickton would never see the light of day again, others were left with a feeling of dissatisfaction. The death penalty, though not an option in Canada, was a topic of heated debate in the aftermath. People wondered if justice had truly been served, or if there was more to the story than the legal system could address. But even as the legal process came to a close, the case was far from over. There were still unanswered questions that would haunt the families and the public for years to come. While Pickton was convicted of 6 murders, there were fears that the true number of victims might be far higher. Some estimates suggested that the number of women he had killed could exceed 20, perhaps even more. The farm, after all, had been a site of such unimaginable horrors, and many believed that the full extent of Pickton's crimes would never be fully understood. The true number of victims may never be known. In fact, many of the women Pickton murdered remain unidentified. The police had been unable to uncover enough evidence to charge him for all the disappearances, leaving lingering questions about the scope of his crimes. Did he murder more than the authorities could confirm? Were there more bodies hidden in the vast expanse of his farm, buried too deep to be discovered? And as Robert Pickton languished in prison, his case continued to cast a shadow over the lives of those who had been touched by it. The families of the victims would never get the closure they desperately needed. No trial, no sentence, no amount of time behind bars could bring back their loved ones or undo the horror that had unfolded on that pig farm. The case would haunt the memories of all who followed it, a chilling reminder of how dark the human capacity for evil can be. The case of Robert Pickton left a deep scar on Canada's collective conscience. It wasn't just the horrific nature of his crimes that lingered in the minds of those who followed the case. It was the devastating realization of how deeply society had failed the victims long before Pickton ever set foot on his farm. But in the wake of this tragedy, there were attempts to make change, to ensure that the dark reality of Pickton's reign of terror would not be forgotten, and to prevent such a thing from ever happening again. In the years that followed, Canada's legal system and law enforcement practices underwent significant scrutiny. The investigation into the missing women had been riddled with failures, and the subsequent trial revealed the deep flaws in the way missing persons cases, particularly involving marginalized communities, were handled. The case revealed not just a serial killer, but a systemic problem of neglect, discrimination, and indifference toward the lives of vulnerable women. One of the most significant changes was a heightened awareness surrounding the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The Pickton case brought these cases into the spotlight, sparking national conversations about the treatment of Indigenous peoples and marginalized groups in Canada. Advocates and families called for more attention, better resources, and stronger laws to protect vulnerable women, especially those in impoverished communities like Vancouver's downtown East Side. The Canadian government, in response to public outcry, began to implement measures to improve investigations into missing persons cases. New policies were developed to ensure better coordination between law enforcement agencies, greater accountability, and more focus on protecting those at risk. But for many, these changes felt like too little, too late. While the legal reforms were a step forward, the impact of Robert Pickton's crimes could not be undone. What had been taken from the victims could never be returned. The legacy of this tragedy was one of deep loss, but it was also one of resilience, a resilience found in the work being done to support the most vulnerable members of society. Despite the horror of Pickton's actions, efforts to protect vulnerable individuals have only strengthened in the years since the case. Various organizations have emerged in the wake of the tragedy, advocating for and providing direct support to marginalized communities. Charities and grassroots movements have worked tirelessly to address the needs of the very people Pickton preyed upon, those living in poverty, those struggling with addiction, and those whose voices had so often been ignored by society. Organizations like the Downtown Eastside Women's Center, as well as numerous indigenous advocacy groups, have been pivotal in helping to support women and other marginalized individuals. These organizations offer safe spaces, provide access to health services, and work to raise awareness about the dangers facing these communities. They remind us that, in the wake of such darkness, there is a glimmer of hope, and that hope is built on the strength and resilience of those who work to protect and uplift the most vulnerable among us. But perhaps the most important lesson we must take from the story of Robert Pickton is the importance of remembering the victims, not just as numbers, not just as statistics, but as real people with lives, dreams, and families. For too long, these women were overlooked, ignored, and treated as expendable. Their stories deserve to be remembered, their lives honored, and their legacies celebrated. Each of these women, whether they were mothers, daughters, sisters, or friends, was a part of something bigger than the horror they endured. Their legacy is a call to action. It is a reminder to see the humanity in everyone, to listen when someone cries out for help, and to fight for those whose voices are often ignored. The memory of these women, their stories, their lives, they continue to inspire those who fight for justice, for equality, and for the protection of the most vulnerable. The tragedy of Robert Pickton's crimes will never be forgotten, but in the shadows of this dark history, there is light, a light that comes from the ongoing efforts to make the world a safer place for those who have been marginalized. The legacy of the victims lives on through those who continue to carry the torch of advocacy, ensuring that no one is ever forgotten again. As we come to the end of this chilling journey through Robert Pickton's crimes, it's impossible to ignore the haunting legacy left behind. A case like no other, it opened our eyes to the darkness lurking in the most unlikely of places, reminding us that sometimes, evil can hide in plain sight. Pickton's reign of terror was not just the result of one man's monstrosity, it was a reflection of a system that failed to protect those most vulnerable in our society. The story of Robert Pickton is a reminder of the consequences of ignoring the cries for help from those living on society's fringes. But it also asks a troubling question: could something like this happen again? With all the changes that have been made, with the greater awareness of the dangers facing marginalized communities, the question remains: how can we ensure that no one is ever forgotten again? The tragedy of these women, their lives stolen, their voices ignored, reminds us of our responsibility to protect the vulnerable, to fight for justice, and to ensure that history never repeats itself. What more can be done to prevent such horrors from happening again? And can we truly trust that the systems in place today are enough to protect those who need it most? These are questions we all must consider. And I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the system has improved since this case? Has justice truly been served, or are we still blind to the dangers lurking in our own society? If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories like this one. Your support helps us continue to bring these chilling tales to light, and we'd love to hear from you. What cases should we explore next? Let us know in the comments. Tomorrow, we'll explore another case that shook the world, one filled with deceit, greed, and betrayal. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and stay safe.